A man like John Calloway has responsibilities. A ranch to run. 800 acres of Gallatin Valley grass that his grandfather broke his back to fence, and his father bled quiet to keep. Cattle that don't care about your feelings. A name that means something in Bozeman. Means handshake deals at the feed store. Means a pew third from the front at First Baptist. Means a man who does what a man is supposed to do. John Calloway has fences to mend, and hay to cut, and a mortgage that doesn't ask permission before it comes due. He has no business thinking about another man the way he's been thinking about him. That's what they'd say. That's what the Valley would say, if it knew. And the Valley always knows. The first time Patrick Dunn showed up at the Calloway ranch, he had a duffel bag held together with duct tape. The boots so worn, the left sole was separating at the toe, and $200 he'd counted 3 times on the Greyhound from Amarillo. He didn't have references. He didn't have a phone number anyone would answer. What he had was a way of standing very still next to a horse that made the animal stop pulling at the bit and just breathe. John noticed that before he noticed anything else. He told himself that's all he noticed. A ranch like the Calloway place needs hands. That's just math. 800 acres, 600 head, and John alone since his father's funeral 14 months ago. His mother moved to her sister's in Billings. The old hands drifted to outfits that paid on time. The place was bleeding money and daylight both, and when a man shows up at your gate and says he can work, you don't ask where he came from, and you ask if he can start tomorrow. Patrick started that afternoon, and a good foreman, a decent, practical, clear-headed foreman, would have seen a young man who was good with animals and strong despite being lean, and left it at that. Would have assigned him the north pasture, shown him the bunkhouse, nodded once, and gone back to his own work. John showed him the north pasture, showed him the bunkhouse, nodded once, then stood at the barn door for a long time, watching Patrick walk away, and hated himself for counting the seconds before he looked back. Patrick looked back. That should have been nothing. A new hand checking the layout, getting his bearings, that's all. That's what a reasonable man would call it. John Calloway is a reasonable man. His father was a reasonable man. Or the Calloways have been reasonable men on reasonable land for 3 generations, and reasonable men don't stand in barn doors at dusk feeling their pulse in their throat because a stranger from Texas turned around. Except John's pulse didn't ask his permission either. The first week was work. Just work. 14-hour days in late June heat, moving cattle to summer pasture, fixing the irrigation line the winter had cracked in 4 places. Patrick worked like he was trying to outrun something, fast, relentless, never complaining, never stopping until John told him to stop. He talked too much at meals and not enough in between, and when he was nervous his accent thickened until Bozeman sounded foreign in his mouth, and when he laughed it was sudden and too loud, like he'd surprised himself by still being capable of it. But John learned that Patrick's mother hadn't spoken to him in 2 years. He learned this not because Patrick told him directly, but because Patrick was on the phone one evening on the porch, and John heard him say, very quietly, "Yes, ma'am, I know. I know what you think. I just wanted to hear your voice." And then silence, and then the sound of a man putting a phone in his pocket with great care, as if it were made of glass, and then more silence. John almost went out to the porch. He didn't. A man minds his own business. A man doesn't insert himself into another man's pain. That's what decency looks like. Distance. That's what his father taught him. Keep your hands busy and your mouth shut, and your feelings where they belong, which is nowhere anyone can see them. That's how you run a ranch. That's how you honor a name. Or that's how you stay the kind of man this valley respects. John's father was very respected. John's father also had a box of letters hidden beneath a false bottom in the old roll-top desk in the office, written in a handwriting that wasn't his mother's, signed with a single initial, R, and filled with the kind of longing that made John sit on the office floor at 2 a.m. and forget how to breathe. But we'll get to that. The trouble with Patrick Dunn, and the valley would call it trouble, make no mistake, is that he doesn't know how to be small. He takes up space without trying. He sings while he works, old country songs with the words half wrong, and his voice carries across the pasture in a way that makes the morning feel less empty. That he cooks like someone who learned to feed himself out of spite and discovered he was gifted at it. Jalapeno cornbread and chili that could make a man weep, and black coffee so strong it could probably restart a dead truck. He leaves a plate wrapped in foil on John's porch when John forgets to eat, which is often, and he never mentions it, which makes it worse, because now John has to sit with a plate of food made by hands he can't stop thinking about and pretend it's just cornbread. It's not just cornbread. It's a man saying, without words, "I see that you're disappearing and I won't let you." And that right there, that quiet, persistent, unrequested care, is the kind of thing this valley doesn't have a category for. Not between two men. Between a man and a woman, sure, it's called devotion. Between two women, or they might call it friendship. Between two men, it's something that doesn't get called anything, because the words for it are the words that get you disinvited from the potluck and prayed over after service and talked about in the feed store parking lot in voices that drop to a whisper when you walk past. Patrick doesn't seem to care about the potluck. Patrick doesn't seem to care about much of anything except the horses and the work and the plate of food he leaves on John's porch every night, and the way he looks at John sometimes, direct, unguarded, like he's already decided that honesty is cheaper than the alternative, and he's done paying full price for other people's comfort. John cares. John cares so much it wakes him up at 3 a.m. and sends him out on horseback into a darkness so complete he can navigate only by the sound of the creek and the muscle memory of a horse that knows the trails better than he does. John has ridden these mountains since he was 6 years old, and he has never once felt as lost as he feels now, standing in his own barn, in his own valley, on his own land, watching a man he hired 6 weeks ago gentle a horse that hasn't let anyone touch it in 2 years, and thinking, I want to know what his hands feel like. That thought is the one the valley would kill, if it could. Not with violence. Bozeman isn't that kind of place, or at least it tells itself it isn't. With silence, with the slow withdrawal of invitations, with the way Mrs. Greer at the general store would start looking just past his shoulder instead of at his eyes, with the way the banker would find reasons to delay the loan renewal, with the way the word Calloway would stop meaning what it's always meant and start meaning something else, something whispered, something pitied, something that proved what happens when a man forgets who he is. John hasn't forgotten who he is. That's the problem. He's remembering. The creek runs through the back 40, cold and fast with snowmelt even in July. The cattle won't cross it until August, when it drops low enough to wade without risk, so the back 40 stays quiet, just grass and cottonwoods and the sound of water over rock. Patrick found it his second week and started swimming there after work, because the bunkhouse shower is a trickle of rust-colored water that takes 20 minutes to get lukewarm. John knows about the creek. He's swum in it every summer of his life. He didn't mention it to Patrick because there is no reason a man needs to mention a creek to another man. It's a creek. It's water. It's the back 40. There is no reason to think about Patrick Dunn standing thigh-deep in glacial runoff, with the sun turning the water white around him and his skin dark gold above it, shaking water out of his hair like a dog, laughing at the cold because Patrick laughs at things that hurt him. That's what he does. He laughs and he cooks and he shows up and he refuses, absolutely refuses to be ashamed of being alive. John rode past the creek on a Tuesday. He wasn't looking. He was checking the fence line on the east side, which runs along the creek, which means he had to ride near the creek, which means it was work, which means it was fine. Patrick was in the water, not swimming, just standing. Still. His back to John, shoulders sharp with cold, head tilted toward the mountains like he was listening to something John couldn't hear. John stopped the horse. He should have kept riding. A decent man would have kept riding, would have cleared his throat or turned the horse or looked away. There were so many ways to look away, and John Calloway knew every single one of them because he'd been practicing looking away his entire life. He didn't look away. Patrick turned, saw him, and instead of covering himself or startling or doing any of the things a man is supposed to do when he's caught bare and exposed, he just stood there, water to his waist, eyes on John, not smiling, not frowning, just present, just honest. Like he was saying, "Here I am. I'm not going to make this easy for you by pretending you weren't looking." John's hands tightened on the reins until the leather creaked. "Water's freezing," Patrick said. "Always is," John said. "You coming in?" The correct answer is no. The correct answer is I've got fence to check. The correct answer is any combination of words that puts distance between this moment and the next one, because this moment is the edge of something, and John Calloway has spent 28 years building a life on the safe side of edges. "Yeah," John said. "I am." He dismounted. He pulled off his boots. He walked into that water like a man walking into church, slow, deliberate, knowing something was about to change and choosing it anyway. The cold hit his chest like a fist and he gasped, and Patrick laughed, that sudden, too loud, or surprised by himself laugh. And John laughed too, and for one moment there was nothing in the world except freezing water and mountain air, and two men standing close enough to touch and not touching, and the sound of laughter echoing off cottonwoods that had been standing in that valley longer than any Calloway, longer than any church, longer than any idea about what a man is supposed to be. They didn't touch. They didn't have to. The valley would say nothing happened. And the valley, for once, would be technically correct. Nothing happened at the creek that day that could be photographed or pointed to or used as evidence. Two men swam. Two men laughed. Two men stood in cold water and looked at each other with an honesty so total it made the air feel thin. Nothing happened. Everything changed. Now, let's talk about what Bozeman knows. Bozeman knows that a man provides. Bozeman knows that a man marries. Bozeman knows that a man sits in church and bows his head and thanks God for the land and the cattle and the wife and the children and the continuation of all things exactly as they've always been. Bozeman knows that a Calloway man, specifically, does these things with extra gravity, because the Calloways are a founding family, which means their blood is in the soil, which means the soil has expectations. Bozeman knows that Patrick Dunn is not from here, that he talks too much and smiles too easy and came from Texas with nothing, which means he left something behind, and a man who leaves things behind is a man with something to hide. Bozeman knows, or thinks it knows, that there is a right way and a wrong way. And the right way has been working for 150 years, and the wrong way is anything that makes the Sunday crowd uncomfortable. Bozeman does not know about the night in the tack room. 3 weeks after the creek. Late. Past midnight. John couldn't sleep. This is not unusual. John hasn't slept a full night since his father died, since before his father died, since maybe ever. And he went to the barn to oil saddles because his hands needed something to do that wasn't writing in the notebook he keeps hidden behind the loose board in the third stall. The notebook filled with verses about hands and heat, and the specific way light falls on a man's jaw when he's looking down. John would die before he'd let anyone read that notebook. Patrick was already in the tack room. He'd found a mare with a swollen fetlock, and he was wrapping it, kneeling on the concrete floor, murmuring the way he does, low, steady, the sound barely words, more rhythm than language, and the mare was standing perfectly still, which she never does, because Patrick's voice does something to frightened creatures that John doesn't understand and understands completely. "You don't sleep either," John said from the doorway. "Never learned how," Patrick said without looking up. John sat down on the floor across from him. The tack room is small. Their knees were close. The mare breathed. The barn creaked in the wind. Somewhere outside, a coyote started and stopped. "My mama called," Patrick said, still wrapping the fetlock, still not looking up. "She wants me to come home." "Home?" "Amarillo. She says my sister needs help with the kids. She says the family needs me." He tied off the wrap with a knot so precise it looked mechanical. "What she means is she wants me back where she can see me, where she can make sure I'm fixed, where she can take me to Pastor Davis on Wednesdays and make me sit in a circle with other men who are trying to pray themselves into something they're not." He looked up. John had never been looked at like that. Not once in 28 years. Not by the girls he'd taken to dances because that's what you do. Not by the woman he'd dated for 11 months in college because his roommate said she was perfect for him, and John had thought maybe if he tried hard enough, wanting would come. It never came. What came instead was a growing horror that he was broken in some fundamental way, unfollowed by the discovery that he wasn't broken at all, which was worse, because broken can be fixed, and whole means this is who you are. Patrick looked at him like he already knew all of that, like he could see the years of trying, like he could see the woman in college and the dances and the prayers John said on his knees in this very barn, begging God to make him different, and the silence that answered, which John eventually understood wasn't absence, but permission. "Are you going?" John asked. "Do you want me to?" The question sat between them like a lit match in dry grass. A smart man would have said, "That's your decision." A careful man would have said, "I just need to know for staffing purposes." A man who wanted to survive in this valley with his name intact would have said something neutral and managerial and safe. "No," John said, "I don't want you to go." Patrick's breath caught. Just barely. Just enough. "Okay," he said. "Okay? I'm staying." The barn was quiet. The mare shifted her weight. The wind pressed against the walls and found no way in. John reached across the space between them and put his hand on Patrick's wrist. Not a grab, not a pull, just a touch. His calloused fingers against the thin skin where Patrick's pulse was hammering so hard, John could feel it like a second heartbeat under his hand. Patrick closed his eyes. They stayed like that. Minutes, an hour. John doesn't know. Time does something strange when you stop lying. It either speeds up or stops entirely, and John couldn't tell which, only that the world outside that tack room had become an abstraction. And the only real thing was the pulse under his fingers and the sound of Patrick breathing. When they finally stood up, Patrick's hand brushed John's jaw. Light. Brief. A touch so gentle it could have been accidental if either of them believed in accidents anymore. "Good night, John." "Good night." Patrick walked to the bunkhouse. John stood in the barn. The mare watched him with dark, unconcerned eyes, because horses don't care who you love. Horses care if you're honest. And for the first time in his life, John Calloway was honest in his own barn, standing on his own land, holding his own hand against his own chest, where the ghost of Patrick's pulse still beat. Nothing happened, the valley would say. The valley doesn't know a goddamn thing. The letters. We need to talk about the letters. But John found them on a Thursday in October, 2 months after the night in the tack room, while looking for the original deed to settle a boundary dispute with the Hendersons. The roll-top desk in the office was his father's. Massive, dark oak, brought by wagon from St. Louis in 1932 by John's great-grandfather. The false bottom was so well made John would never have found it if the desk hadn't shifted in moving, leaving a gap where the wood had warped. 14 letters, written between 1983 and 1991. The handwriting was not his mother's. It was angular and impatient, the handwriting of a man who thinks faster than he writes. Signed R. addressed to my Thomas. John's father's name was Thomas. A man in his right mind would have put them back. John read everyone. R was a ranch hand. R worked the Calloway ranch the summer of 1983, when Thomas Calloway was 26 and newly married, and already carrying whatever it was that made him quiet, in ways that went beyond personality. R was from somewhere south. The letters mentioned heat, mentioned missing the sound of Spanish, mentioned a sister in Tucson. R loved Thomas Calloway with a desperation that bled through the ink, that turned grown man handwriting shaky, that said things like, "I think about your hands every time I try to sleep," and "I don't know how to go back to a world where I pretend I don't know you." And, in the last letter, dated November 1991, "I understand why you can't leave. I don't forgive you for it, but I understand. And I will love you past the understanding and past the anger and past whatever comes next, because loving you is the only true thing I've ever done." John sat on the office floor until dawn. His father, Thomas Calloway, the man who taught him to shoe a horse, to check a fence, to shake a man's hand like you mean it. The man who went to church every Sunday and sat in the third pew and bowed his head and was respected, deeply and widely respected, by a valley that never knew. The man who kept a box of letters from a man named R hidden in a desk for 30 years and never told anyone and never left and died on this land with this secret and these letters and whatever was left of a love he chose to bury rather than live. John's father chose the valley, chose the name, chose the pew and the handshake and the mortgage and the careful, lifelong performance of being the kind of man Bozeman could understand. And it killed him. Not fast. Slow. The way drought kills, not with a single blow but with a relentless, patient subtraction, until the thing that needed water is still standing but hollow inside, and one day a wind comes that shouldn't be strong enough to fell anything, and it falls. Thomas Calloway died of a heart attack at 59. The doctor said it was genetics. John, holding 14 letters on the office floor, thought, no, it was silence. He died of silence. Now here is the question the valley doesn't want asked. What exactly was Thomas Calloway protecting? The name? The name is 3 syllables. It goes on a mailbox and a property deed and a headstone. It doesn't keep you warm. It doesn't sit with you at 3 a.m. When the coyotes are loud and the dark is total, and the only thing between you and the void is the sound of another person breathing. The land? The land doesn't care. The land has been here since before the Calloways and will be here after. The land doesn't read the Bible. The land doesn't have opinions about what a man does in his barn at midnight. The land asks only for labor, which it repays in grass and silence, and it would have accepted Thomas Calloway and R the same way it accepts the rain, completely, without judgment, because judgment requires a smallness the land has never possessed. The respect of Bozeman? Bozeman's respect is a lease, not a deed. It's renewed annually based on conditions. It can be revoked for failures of conformity, and its terms are written by people who have never once been asked to choose between everything they are and everything they're supposed to be. Thomas Calloway protected nothing. He abandoned everything. He had the letters and the love and the one true thing, and he folded it into a box and buried it beneath a false bottom and lived on top of it for 30 years. And when he died, the valley said what a good man and meant what an obedient one. And the difference between those two things is the entire distance between a life lived and a life performed. John is not his father. John swore that on the office floor with the letters in his hands and the sun coming up over the bridgers. He swore it to R, whose last name he doesn't know. He swore it to his father, who he loves and pities and rages at in equal measure. He swore it to himself, and he meant it the way a man means things at dawn after a night without sleep, completely, desperately, with the fragile ferocity of someone who has just realized that the cage was never locked. He told Patrick about the letters, not all at once, in pieces, over days, the way you tell someone a truth that changes the shape of your own history. They were on the porch, after dinner, after work, in that liminal hour when the sun drops behind the tobacco roots, and the valley turns blue and gold, and the air smells like sage and cooling dust. Patrick listened the way he listens, entirely, without interrupting, without offering comfort or platitudes or any of the things people say when they don't know how to sit with someone else's pain. He listened the way he stands with horses, still, present, his whole body a message that said, "I'm here, I'm not leaving, take your time." When John finished, Patrick was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My daddy found out about me because my cousin saw me with a guy at a gas station in Lubbock, holding hands. That's it, just holding hands. My daddy drove 4 hours to pick me up and didn't say a word the entire drive. When we got home, my mama was in the kitchen crying like someone died. My daddy sat me down and said, 'You have a choice. You can be my son, or you can be this. You can't be both.' He said it like he was reading the weather, like it was just a fact about the world." Patrick's voice was steady. The steadiness was worse than breaking would have been. I said, "I guess I can't be your son then." And he stood up and walked out. My mama followed him. I packed a bag and left. That was 2 years ago. My sister sends me pictures of the kids sometimes. My mama calls when my daddy's at work, but she always sounds like she's committing a crime. He looked at John. "Your daddy had letters. I had a hand at a gas station. Same cage, different locks." John wanted to say something large enough to hold all of that. He couldn't. So he did what Patrick had done. He stayed. He sat on that porch in the blue-gold light and stayed. And after a while, Patrick leaned sideways until his shoulder touched John's. And they stayed like that. Two men pressed together at the shoulder on a porch in Montana. And it was such a small thing, such a tiny gesture, the kind of thing no one would photograph or point to or call evidence, and it was the bravest thing John had ever felt. Because it was a choice. Thomas Calloway never made that choice. Thomas Calloway sat on this same porch, probably, and watched this same light, and wanted this same thing, and chose the valley instead. And the valley repaid him with a headstone that says, "Beloved husband and father," and a box of letters that nobody was supposed to find. John leaned back into the pressure of Patrick's shoulder. The valley said nothing. It was too dark to read. Here is what the church in Bozeman teaches, that God made man and woman, that the union of man and woman is sacred, that the family is the foundation of civilization, and the deviation from family is the unraveling of all things decent and ordered and good, that a man who lies with a man has turned his face from God, that love, real love, the love that God blesses, looks like a husband and a wife and children and a house and a pew on Sunday morning and a casserole dropped off when someone's sick and a handshake that means I see you and you're one of us. Here is what the church in Bozeman doesn't teach. That John Calloway makes Patrick's coffee before his own every morning, and that he makes it with 2 sugars because he noticed Patrick puts in 2 sugars, and that he noticed because he notices everything about Patrick. The way you notice weather, the way you notice the shift in a horse's gait that tells you something's wrong, not because you're trying, but because your whole body is turned toward this person like a compass toward north, and that Patrick restitched the tear in John's favorite jacket, the old Carhartt that smells like hay and engine grease, while John was asleep on the couch after a 20-hour calving day, and he did it with stitches so small, and even they looked machine-made, because Patrick's hands can be impossibly gentle when they choose to be, which is often, which is always, which is every time he's near something he loves. That when the Hendersons' bull broke through the east fence, and John spent 9 hours in freezing rain bringing cattle back. Patrick met him at the barn door with a thermos of soup and dry clothes, and stood close enough that John could feel the heat coming off his body, and didn't say a word, because some things are too important for words, and some words are too small for what they're carrying. The church has a word for what John and Patrick are to each other, and the word is sin. But sin doesn't restitch your jacket while you sleep. Sin doesn't learn how you take your coffee. Sin doesn't drive into a rainstorm to meet you at the barn door with soup and silence and warmth. Sin is a word for people who've never built anything worth protecting. What John and Patrick are building doesn't have a word in the church's vocabulary. It barely has a word in the valley's vocabulary. It has a word in the language of hands and heat and mornings and mended jackets, but that language doesn't get spoken from pulpits, so the church pretends it doesn't exist, and the valley follows the church's lead, because the valley has always followed someone else's lead, which is how you know the valley has never been as brave as it thinks it is. Out the storm. October in Montana can turn without warning, blue sky to blizzard in 2 hours. John and Patrick were moving the last of the summer herd off the high pasture, 15 miles up past the tree line, into country so open and exposed that weather doesn't approach. It arrives, like a wall falling. They saw it coming. Dark horizon, temperature dropping so fast you could taste metal in the air. They pushed the cattle hard and got most of them down to the mid-pasture gate, but the sky broke before they could make the ranch. Sleet first, then wind, then snow so dense it erased the mountains. The herding cabin is at 9,000 feet. A single room, a wood stove, 2 cots, supplies for 3 days. Built by John's grandfather for exactly this, for the storms that don't ask. They got the horses into the lean-to. I got the fire going. Got their wet clothes hung on nails by the stove, and sat on the floor in blankets that smelled like cedar and mouse. And outside the wind was a sound like tearing fabric, endless, huge, and inside the cabin was small and warm and lit by firelight, and there was no one in the world but them. John. Patrick said his name the way he says everything, direct, no armor, no angle. Yeah. I'm tired of being careful. John looked at him. Firelight on Patrick's face, the scar on his upper lip, the amber of his eyes made darker by shadow, the way his hands rested on his knees, open, upturned, as if he were offering something. I've been careful my whole life, Patrick said. I was careful in Amarillo. I was careful at the gas station, and I was careful with my daddy, and I was careful when I got on the bus, and I've been careful every single day on this ranch because I thought careful was how you survive. But I don't want to survive, John. I came all the way to Montana to survive, and now I don't want that anymore. I want to be alive. The fire cracked. The wind screamed. The cabin held. I've never been anything but careful, John said. I know. My father was careful for 30 years. He was so careful he died. I know. I don't want to die careful. Then don't. The distance between them was 3 feet of cabin floor, 3 feet of warped pine planks. But 3 feet that contained the entire weight of everything they'd been taught, and everything they'd feared, and everything the valley and the church and their fathers and the whole grinding machinery of how things are had told them was impossible, unacceptable, wrong. John crossed it. He put his hand on Patrick's face the way Patrick touched frightened horses, slowly, with his whole attention, trembling with the effort of being gentle enough. Patrick's skin was warm from the fire, and rough with cold, and John felt the jaw, the cheekbone, the stubble that rasped against his calloused palm, and Patrick turned his face into John's hand and exhaled like a man who has been holding his breath for 25 years and has finally been given permission to stop. I see you, Patrick whispered. I've seen you since the first day. In the barn, on the porch, at the creek. I've seen all of it. The poetry you hide. The way you ride out at night because you can't sleep. The way you make my coffee before yours. I see you, John. I see every single thing you think you're hiding." John's forehead dropped to Patrick's. Their breath mixed. The fire threw their shadows on the wall. Two shapes becoming one, becoming something new, becoming something the cabin had probably seen before, because this cabin was built before the church arrived, and before the valley had opinions, and the mountains don't keep records of who loves whom. What happened next is between John and Patrick, and the storm, and the fire, and the 9,000-foot darkness. What happened next is that two men stopped being careful. What happened next is that the sound of the wind was replaced, for a while, by quieter sounds, breathing and movement, and the small, wrecked noises people make when they finally stop pretending, sounds that were swallowed by the storm so completely that by morning it was as if the mountain itself had absorbed their secret and kept it, the way mountains keep everything, patiently, without judgment, for geological time. In the morning the storm had broken, pink light on new snow, the world scrubbed clean and silent and impossibly bright. They saddled the horses. They rode down. Patrick reached across the space between the horses and took John's hand. In the open, on a trail, in daylight, in Montana. John let him. Now, the valley would like to have a word. The valley has seen things. The valley has noticed that John Calloway's new hand has been on the ranch for 5 months now and hasn't left, and that John doesn't come to the Stockman's bar on Fridays anymore, and that the two of them were seen in John's truck in town, and Patrick was in the passenger seat, which is where a wife would sit. And there's no reason to read into that except that people read into everything, always, because reading into things is the valley's only sport that doesn't require a horse. The valley would like to point out that John's father would be turning in his grave, that the Calloway name means something, that there's been talk at the diner and talk at the church, and that Mrs. Henderson said she saw them standing too close at the hardware store, and that doesn't mean anything by itself, but it means something in aggregate, and the aggregate is making people uncomfortable. The valley would like to remind John that there's a way things work. The valley would like to suggest, gently, pastorally, with the best of intentions, that perhaps Patrick Dunn has had a bad influence, that perhaps John has been lonely since his father's passing and has confused gratitude for something else, that perhaps this is a phase, a grief reaction, a temporary madness that will clear like weather if John just comes back to church and sits in the third pew and bows his head and remembers who he is. The valley means well. The valley always means well. But the valley meant well when it told Thomas Calloway that R was not the right kind of hand. And Thomas let him go and kept the letters and lived 40 more years in a silence so complete it calcified his heart. The valley meant well then, and means well now, and will mean well forever. And it will never, ever understand that its meaning well is the blade it uses, and the wound is always in the same place, and the people it cuts are always the ones it claims to love. John does not come to church. John does not explain. John does not defend himself, because the truth does not require defense. It requires only the willingness to stand in it, and John is standing in it now, on his own land, with his own hands, next to a man whose shoulder he knows the exact temperature of. And if the valley wants to take the name and the pew and the handshake, the valley can have them. He will keep the man. Patrick's mother comes in November. She arrives without warning, which is how mothers arrive when they're on missions from God, or from guilt, or from whatever mixture of the two drives a woman to buy a plane ticket to Montana in winter. She is small and tidy, and her name is Darlene, and she stands in the ranch house kitchen and says, Your sister is pregnant again, and your daddy's knees are getting worse and the family needs you, Patrick. What she means is, come home. Be the son we recognize. Stop being whoever you are here, in this place, with this man. Patrick pours her coffee. He makes it the way she likes it. He remembers. Milk, no sugar. And he sets it in front of her with a gentleness that breaks John's heart, because it is the gentleness of a son who still loves the hand that pushed him away. Mama, Patrick says, I'm not coming home. This isn't home. Home is Amarillo. Home is your people. My people are here. Your people are your blood, your family. My family is here. She looks at John. The look contains everything the valley contains, the judgment, the confusion, the desperate desire for the world to be simpler than it is. John meets her eyes. He doesn't flinch. He's done flinching. Mrs. Dunn, John says, your son saved my ranch. He saved my horses. He probably saved my life. I don't know what you think is happening here, but what's happening here is that your son is the best man I've ever known. And I'm not going to stand in my own kitchen and pretend otherwise. Darlene's hands tighten around the coffee cup. Patrick reaches under the table and puts his hand on John's knee. Not for Darlene, not as a statement or a provocation. For himself. For John. Because touch is how Patrick tells the truth. And the truth right now is I'm here and I'm not ashamed, and I love you in my mother's presence because I refuse to love you only in the dark. Darlene sees the gesture. Something in her face does something complicated. It breaks and hardens and breaks again, the way ice does in March, cracking and refreezing and cracking again, until eventually the river wins. She doesn't say anything else. She finishes her coffee. She hugs Patrick at the door, and the hug is stiff and long and contains years of things she can't say and may never say. She drives to the airport. 2 days later, Patrick gets a text from his sister. Mama told Daddy she went to see you and that you're okay. She said, he's okay. He's okay. It's not, I love you. It's not, I accept you. It's not, I was wrong. But it's a crack in the ice. And Patrick, who tames impossible horses by standing still and waiting, knows that cracks are how rivers start. The offer comes in December. Bridger Valley Corporation, a development company out of Denver. They want the Calloway Ranch, all 800 acres, for a resort and residential community. The number they offer has more zeros than John has seen outside of a bank statement. It's enough to pay off the mortgage, the equipment loans, the back taxes. It's enough to start over. It's enough to leave. The Valley would say, don't sell. To which the Valley would say the land is heritage, is legacy, is identity. The Valley would say a Calloway doesn't walk away. But the Valley said the same thing to Thomas Calloway, and Thomas stayed, and the staying killed him. John stands at the fence line at dawn, looking east across the pasture where the cattle are black shapes against white snow. Patrick is beside him. Their shoulders touch. Their breath makes ghosts in the cold air. If I sell, John says, I lose everything my family built. If you stay because they want you to, Patrick says, you lose everything you're building. What am I building? Patrick looks at him. The amber eyes, the scar on the lip, the face John knows better than his own now, because he studied it in firelight and moonlight and the flat gray light of Montana winter mornings, and every version of it is the version he wants. Us, Patrick says, you're building us. The Valley will talk. The Valley always talks. The Valley will say that John Calloway sold the ranch and left with the hired hand, and that the Calloway name is finished in Bozeman. And isn't that a shame? Isn't that a waste? Isn't that proof of something gone wrong? The Valley will say these things in the diner and the church and the feed store and the parking lot, and the words will be heavy with certainty, the certainty of people who have never had to choose between who they are and who they're supposed to be, and who therefore believe the choice is simple. The valley will not say that John kept 40 acres, the back 40, the creek, the cottonwoods, the cabin at 9,000 feet. But he sold the rest, and kept the part that mattered, the part where the water runs, the part where the horses graze in summer, the part where two men stood thigh-deep in glacial runoff and laughed at the cold and looked at each other and didn't look away. That Patrick started a horse training operation on those 40 acres that within 2 years had a waiting list 6 months long, because word travels when you can gentle an animal everyone else gave up on, and people will drive from 3 states away to watch a man whisper a horse into trust. That John writes. Not poetry hidden in barns anymore. Essays, stories, about land and love and the lies men tell to avoid being free. He publishes under his own name because he promised himself on an office floor at dawn that he would not be his father, and keeping that promise means signing his name to the truth, even when the truth makes the valley uncomfortable, especially when the truth makes the valley uncomfortable. That the letters from R are framed in their kitchen, not hidden, not buried, hung on the wall where the morning light hits them, because those letters are proof that love existed in this valley long before anyone gave it permission, and they deserve to be read in daylight. That on Saturday mornings John makes coffee, 2 sugars for Patrick, and they sit on the porch of the smaller house they built together on the 40 acres, and the mountains are still there, and the creek still runs, and the sky is still so big it makes you feel both insignificant and infinite. And John reaches over without thinking and puts his hand on Patrick's wrist where the pulse is, and Patrick turns his hand over so their palms meet, and they sit like that, 2 men holding hands on a porch in Montana, in daylight, without apology, without explanation, without performance, just sitting in the truth of themselves like it's the most natural thing in the world. Because it is. It always was. The only thing that was ever unnatural was the lie. There is no sermon large enough to contain what John Calloway and Patrick Dunn have. There is no pew wide enough. There is no valley deep enough. There is no word in any church's vocabulary for the way a man learns another man's coffee order and makes it first, every morning, without being asked for the rest of his life. The church calls it sin. The valley calls it shame. Thomas Calloway called it a secret, and died with it folded in a box. John calls it Tuesday morning. Patrick calls it home. They're right. Everyone else was just afraid. And fear. Here is the thing about fear that the preachers won't tell you, that the valley won't admit, that the fathers who say you can't be both will never understand. Fear is not the voice of God. Fear is the voice of people who need you to be small so they can feel big. Fear is the sound a cage makes when it realizes the door was never locked. Fear is loud and certain and absolutely catastrophically wrong. Love is quiet. Love is 2 sugars. Love is a jacket mended while you sleep. Love is a hand on a wrist in a tack room at midnight. Love is 40 acres and a creek and a cabin where the storm can't reach you. Love is a man from Texas who showed up with nothing and built everything. But love is a man from Montana who found letters in a desk and swore he wouldn't repeat the silence. Love is not a sermon. Love is not a sin. Love is not a phase or a confusion or a grief reaction or a bad influence. Love is John Calloway and Patrick Dunn, holding hands on a porch in Montana, in the light, where anyone can see. That's all it ever needed to be.
Enjoyed this story? Good. Because I have so much more to tell you, but those other ones I can't put out here. It's not for everyone. It's for those who really want to go deep. On my Patreon, the stories are more intense, more free, more real. No censorship, no filter, no limitations. It's the place where I can truly explore everything these characters live, feel, and desire. Things that don't make it out here. And trust me, there's a lot waiting for you. And it's not just content, it's a community. A closed space for those who want real representation, who want to support the LGBTQ+ cause and have access to benefits nobody else has. Early content, behind the scenes, stories only members get to know, and a group of people who think just like you. A place where we can talk about everything, without judgment, without limits. There are already a lot of people inside following stories you don't even know exist yet. And every month, there's something new coming. Getting in is easy. Point your phone camera at the QR code on screen right now, or use the link in the first pinned comment down below or in the video description. In less than 2 minutes, you're already part of it. See you on the other side.